Good evening. I'm Dr. John Spencer. I'm the Interim Director of the Tuohy Chair of Interreligious Studies here at John Carroll University, and I'd like to welcome you to this presentation this evening. I would first like to invite Dr. John Day, who is the Provost and Academic Vice President of the University, to provide a welcome to the University. Dr. Day?
Thank you, John. On behalf of Father Robert Nihoff, President of John Carroll, and all the John Carroll community, I'd especially like to welcome our visitors to the campus this evening. We're very pleased to be able to offer these series of lectures every year. As you may have seen in the information flashing through, the Tuohy Chair in Interreligious Studies was founded in 1966, so this is a long-standing activity at John Carroll. And this year we're especially pleased to have with us Dr. David Barr from Wright State University to continue the conversations around interreligious studies, interreligious dialogue. Again, welcome on behalf of the university, and John is going to tell us a bit more about Dr. Barr.
Thank you, John. This evening, I want to spend a small amount of time introducing you to both the lecture series and to our lecturer this evening. This lecture series, Jerusalem, Jesus, and Jihad, End Times Scenarios in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is this year's edition of the Walter and Mary Tuohy Lectures in Interreligious Studies. These lectures are supported by a fund provided by Walter and Mary Tuohy. Mr. Tuohy was the Chief Executive Officer of the Chesapeake and Ohio, the C&O Railroad. Given his interest in interreligious studies, he and his wife Mary established an endowed chair in interreligious studies in 1966. This makes it one of the first ecumenical chairs at an American university. We here at John Carroll University are both very grateful to Walter and Mary Tuohy for their generosity, and very privileged to carry on the practice of engaging in different religious traditions through a thoughtful, intellectual, and respectful conversations. This evening's lectures will continue that practice. Our lecturer tonight, and for the next 5 weeks, is Dr. David Barr. He is Professor of Religion at Wright State University. Dr. Barr began his academic career at Fort Wayne Bible College, where he received his BA and got his first taste of Bible study. From there, he went on to Florida State University, where he received his MA and PhD. His dissertation is titled, Toward a Definition of the Gospel Genre, a generic analysis and comparison of the Synoptic Gospels and the Socratic dialogue by means of Aristotle's theory of tragedy, by a mouthful. After completing the dissertation, he went on to teach at Florida A&M University, at the University of Northwest Iowa, before landing at Wright State, where he has taught for over 30 years. During his career, he's published 8 books, authored more than 35 articles and over 25 reviews, and given dozens of lectures at scholarly meetings. Among his published books, let me note that several focus on the book of Revelation. In addition, he's written a New Testament textbook entitled New Testament Story and Introduction, which is frequently used in undergraduate courses, which has undergone several updates and new editions. This is indeed an impressive series of publications. And all of this is by way of saying we have a well-qualified scholar before us this evening. I have known David for some time, and I've always been impressed by his quiet insightfulness and by his willingness to stretch the boundaries of scholarship in order to try new and creative approaches to understanding the Bible. One simple example is his desire to stage the book of Revelation as a dramatic reading, and thereby see what we can learn from that kind of approach to the text. Indeed, this is something in which his students in his class this semester are engaged. Perhaps he'll say more about that at some point during his lectures. Hence, I'm very much looking forward to the series of lectures that explore the ways in which Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, 3 monotheistic religions, have approached the understanding of the end times. Fancy words for this are eschatology and apocalypticism, words I'm sure Dr. Barr will explain and use from time to time. but they reflect the way in which people of different traditions have sought to cope with the troubled times in which they find themselves, and with their constant realization that this earthly life ends. I'm excited to hear Dr. Barr as he carries us into these end times and examines the similarities and differences of how these three religious traditions approach the end. And with that, I will end. This evening's lecture is entitled, Who Says It's the End Times? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barr.
Thank you. We'll see if you still feel that way in 2 hours when I finish. Actually, it won't be 2 hours. It doesn't seem like it.
Mic on?
Oh yeah, turn the mic on. But they're laughing. They must hear me. Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
How about now? No? Mic's not working anymore?
Button up there. Lord have mercy. I'll keep talking. It's not the end of the world. That's what my grandmother used to say to me when I had some minor injury and was crying uncontrollably, thinking, I think, that it would somehow console me. It did not. But I think most people are like my grandmother, who lived through 2 world wars and the Great Depression, without ever imagining that she lived at the end of the world. Pollsters tell us that Americans are somewhat ambivalent. I'm supposed to be pressing these buttons here. Somewhat ambivalent about... This is not going to work for a moment. There we go. About whether they believe in the end times or not. About 3/4 of us say they believe in the return of Jesus to earth. Less than 20% think it's going to happen in their lifetime. However, about 1/3 think they ought to watch current events just in case they indicate that the end times are here. The numbers are even greater for Muslims. Worldwide, about half or more believe they will live to see the return of a savior figure called the Mahdi. This expectation seems to vary widely by country. Very high in some countries, very low in others. And different between different kinds of Islam, as we'll talk about in a few moments. I haven't been able to find a similar survey of Judaism, but the recent poll of Israeli Jews found that about 51% of Israelis believe in the coming of the Messiah. So in 3 religions that constitute about half the world's population, somewhere around half of them believe that the end times are at hand. So the first answer to my question tonight, who says it's the end times, in case you forgot, is a lot of people do. At least if you ask the question in a vague enough way. There is a small but vocal minority that not only believes that the end times are coming, but they know how and why and perhaps even when. You've perhaps heard of some of them. Tim LaHaye and the Left Behind series of books and movies about the rapture that will take all the Christians out of the world. Hal Lindsey, who wrote The Late Great Planet Earth, and the first edition of which in the 1960s predicted the end of the world in 1988, 40 years after the founding of the State of Israel. He's had to revise that since then. More recently, Harold Camping in his Billboard campaign proclaimed May 21 as Judgment Day. And there are others who think that they have a hand in bringing about the end of the world, such as David Koresh, not his real name, at Waco, claimed to be God's agent to bring about the end. Many more claim to read the signs of the times and predict an imminent end. Now, the fact that such a concern for the end times can pass over so quickly into sheer craziness should not taint the whole enterprise. We are, after all, a storytelling culture, species, and it's only natural to want to know what the end of the story might be like. But I stand with my grandma. It's not the end of the world. Even so, there is perhaps something to be learned by examining how other people think about the end of the world. The purpose of these lectures is to survey the stories, explore where they come from, consider their significance for the world we live in, And while I remain agnostic, that is, I do not believe the world will end in any religious sense, I live in a world with people who do. But first, a minor confession. I'm not an expert in any one of these three religions, which might make you wonder what I'm doing up front here. I've only scratched the surface of the vast bodies of literature and traditions connected with each of them. I know enough to appreciate the great diversity of their traditions and to understand my own ignorance. My expertise, such as it is in understanding how people think about the end of the world. I spent a good part of my career looking at the ancient world and various kinds of people who talk about the world coming to an end. I present these lectures not because I understand all that the various Jews, Christians, and Muslims think about this, but because I want to understand. I present them as an opportunity to think together with you about this very important subject. So perhaps I should clarify a little bit what I'm doing in these lectures by making two preliminary distinctions. First, scholars, especially American and European scholars, tend to talk about the end of the world as a theological idea, a set of propositional statements to which believers subscribe, for which we have the fine word eschatology. That's not what I'm going to do. Exploring eschatology would make an interesting series of lectures where Christians embed their end-time thinking in their creeds, and it is a required item of faith in the Muslim system of belief. But I'm not interested in theology as an abstract. I'm interested in the stories people tell themselves and the function of those stories in their lives. Now, religion can be studied in different ways. Take religious dietary laws. You could study them theologically, asking how they function to provide order and an orderly sense of what the world is like. You could study them pragmatically, perhaps looking at the dietary laws and health concerns. Or you could study them functionally, that is, what do they do for the people who follow such laws? On the one hand, creating a strong sense of community for those who keep them, on the other hand, separating that community from other communities that do not keep them. It is this function of religion that I'm interested in and intend to pursue in terms of the end-time scenarios. You do not have to believe in the gods to study Roman religion. You do not have to believe in Satan to understand the influence of that idea in our world. You don't have to believe in the end times in order to learn something from people who do. So the distinction I'm trying to make is between two ways of studying religion, which today we call theology on the one hand and religion studies on the other. Now, theology is an old and honored academic discipline attempting to understand religion from the inside. How do we conceptualize the religion that we share together? It is a useful academic exercise. Religion studies, on the other hand, is a relatively new discipline and an evolving practice of understanding religion from the outside. That is, trying to understand religion through history, sociology, political science, economics, phenomenology, and other such methods. Religion studies seeks the human meaning of religion, not its truth or falsehood, not its final meaning, but how it functions to give meaning to the life of those who adhere to it. And so, a second preliminary point, just because Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all share some common ideas about the final judgment, about how the end times are going to work, does not mean that these ideas function in the same way in all three traditions. The same idea may function differently in different systems. As outsiders, and we're all outsiders to some of these traditions, who wish to understand how these traditions work, we must seek more than their ideas. Religion is not just a set of beliefs. In fact, for Jews and Muslims, practice is at least as important, maybe more important than belief. There's a hadith from Muhammad that says the first thing that one will be asked about on the Day of Judgment is whether one has done one's required prayers, a ritual activity. And there's a charming story that the rabbis tell. They were debating one day whether it was possible for an atheist to please God, whether it was more important to believe in God or to simply keep the rules. As they debated, a voice from heaven came down and said, "Better they forget me and keep my commandments." So for Judaism, practice is more important than the ideological beliefs. My own study of religion has primarily looked at the literary, historical, and social context of early Christian literature. I ask, what's the story being told? When did it arise? How does it affect the life of the community for whom and to whom it is told? So in these lectures, I seek to describe for you the story being told about the end times by these three traditions. I hope to do more than describe. I hope eventually to understand. I want to understand the origins of such thinking, the stuff out of which it's made, the implications for those who believe and for those of us who do not believe. I also wish to emphasize some of the positive aspects of the various conceptions of the end times. Along the way, we'll hear some intriguing stories, encounter some interesting concepts, learn some new vocabulary, and think about some novel ideas. So let's begin. Funny, you thought I already had, didn't you? Let's begin with one of the most basic and interesting concepts that we have to deal with, the notion of the end. I'm probably behind on the slide. Let's see if we have the end. All three traditions talk about a coming end. Jews tend to speak of the end of days, Christians tend to speak of the last days or the latter days, and Muslims tend to speak of the final hour. This should alert us to the possibility that each is doing something somewhat distinctive. Still, they share the basic concept that God is in control of history, that our historical events are thus significant for the understanding of God's work, and that history will culminate in the day of judgment. All three traditions see this judgment day as personal, that is, each individual must be accountable for each of his actions at the time of their death, but all three also speak of a more universal and collective end. Now, the most basic meaning of end is that something is terminated. History, perhaps, or the present political system, or the physical universe. This is what my grandmother meant when she said it's not the end of the world. Such an end is usually accompanied by, in the imagination of proponents in all three traditions, catastrophic events, earthquakes, floods, wars, cosmic upheavals. This is what we think of when we see the cartoon figure carrying a sign around the end is near. The connection of the end with catastrophic events means that any time we experience unusually severe circumstances, some will see it as a sign that the end times have arrived. So the first meaning of end is termination. The jig is up. Closing time. It's all over. But the word end has another sense. It can mean something positive. The end of childhood is an adult. The end of education is wisdom. The end of the football game is Miller time. So with the end times, in every case it carries a secondary meaning of a new beginning. For the end of the current system makes way for something new, a new human community that fulfills its true purpose and destiny. This dual sense of the end as both catastrophe and opportunity is nicely captured in a metaphor common to early Christianity and early Judaism, the metaphor of the birth pangs of the Messianic age. The metaphor, once you grasp it, is obvious and quite insightful, but the birth process involves a steady building up of pressure, beginning of contractions with their accompanying pains, the intensification of these pains until finally the release of birth. There is suffering, but the suffering has a purpose. Just so the cataclysmic events portrayed at the end of the age result in a new world, a world of justice, peace, and prosperity in all three of these traditions. In this sense, every vision of the end is also a creation story, the beginning of something new. And as we will see eventually, every creation story is also a vision of the end. Apocalyptic literature, that is literature written about the end times, has a dual goal. It wants to prepare people for the coming end, but it also wants to affect the way they live in the world now by portraying what the world looks like through their eyes. It encourages people to live in a different way. First, by imagining what that different way might be in this future ideal, and then by painting a picture of the present age of things that must be avoided. Now, however strange these stories at the end may seem to us who stand in other traditions, we may still learn something important about the human desire for the transformation of society by listening to them. And make no mistake, the stories are strange. There's nothing about our ordinary experience of life, where day follows night, night follows day, season follows season, year follows year, to suggest that there is an end to the world. There is, of course, an end to the individual human life, but the life of the family, the community, the tribe continues. Why should there be an end at all? It's difficult to know just where the idea of an end comes from. So long ago that it seems to us in the West like a natural idea. There's nothing similar in Asian traditions, Confucianism and Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism. Imagine ends of various kinds, but they're always ends of renewal, recycling, a new beginning, not simply an end, as it is in the Western system. The same can be said for Greco-Roman thought, which imagined the gradual decline of the ages from an age of gold to silver, bronze, and iron, and then in this extract from Virgil, the imagination that perhaps with this boy's birth, that in Augustus a new age would begin, a golden age, renewing the Iron Age ceasing. So a renewal, but not an end. A similar recurrent renewal is imagined in the Hebrew prophets after the analogy of the Sabbath day, or the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord, as it's usually translated in English. Isaiah says, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it and going your own way, I will feed you with the heritage of your ancestor Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. But by some process not preserved in the historical record, this notion of a weekly Sabbath day is projected as a grand Sabbath, sometime when final judgments would be made, in which there is not only the renewal of the Sabbath, but there is the darker side of judgment of those who do not keep the tradition. See, the day of the Lord comes with cruel wrath and fierce anger, Isaiah writes. I'll put an end to the pride of the arrogant and lay low the insolence of the tyrants. Now, laying low the tyrants is a good idea for those of us who suffer under tyranny. But what if we are the tyrants? What if it is our sins that are being judged? In that case, perhaps it is not such a good thing after all. A near contemporary of Isaiah, the prophet Amos, writes in a somewhat humorous scene, why do you want the day of the Lord? It's darkness and not light. And he says it's like going for a walk in the woods and you run into a lion. Scared witless, you turn and run the other direction and run smack into a bear. If perchance you get away from the bear, you go home and lean against the wall and say, well, thank God, a snake comes out and bites you. He was a rather pessimistic fellow, though humorous. This reference in Amos may be the first reference to an end as a final end in Western literature. At least John Collins thinks it is. This is the first step on the way to the concept of the end times. The elementary notion that the end of an end when sinners would be punished would take hundreds of years to evolve into a concept of the end times. So here I'm making a difference between a concept of an end and the concept that you live in the end times. Those who believe they live in the end times think that the times that they live in are systematically, qualitatively different than other times. These are the times of the closing, the time just before the bell, the last 2 minutes of the ball game, when everything is going to pick up. Now, historically speaking, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam emerged out of the same common tradition. Judaism and Christianity in the 2nd century. Separation was gradual and varied from city to city to well into the 5th century. Islam emerged from the matrix of these two traditions as they existed in Syria, Palestine, and Arabia in the 7th century CE. And here I need a brief footnote on dates. Each of these traditions has its own way of marking time. The Jews mark it from the beginning of creation. So on their calendar, it is A.M. Anno Mundi, 5774. Christianity dates it from a slight miscalculation of the date of Jesus' birth, and thus dated in the year of our Lord, Anno Domini, 2013. Islam dates the calendar from the migration, it's called, the hijra of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, where he set up the first Islamic government in the year 621-22 on the Christian calendar. And so it is 1435 on a hijra on the Islamic calendar. Now it would be both confusing and challenging, especially since they're not synchronized. The Islamic calendar is lunar and thus is 10 days shorter than the solar calendar, so that you have to have a mathematical formula to figure out the dates. So what scholars have done is say, well, just forget it. Throw your papers in the air. We're going to use the Christian numbers. We're going to take away the Christian scaffolding. It's no longer the year of our Lord, 2013. It's 2013 of the Common Era, or 750 before the Common Era. So that's a footnote you can feel free to ignore. By the time that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam emerged as separate traditions, There's a generally fixed canon of scriptures that all three pay homage to. They do it, however, by adding some footnotes. In fact, each tradition has produced a second body of sacred texts that both adopted and transformed the Hebrew scriptures into something new. So for Jews, the Hebrew scriptures become Torah, instructions for living. And they created another body of literature, the Mishnah and the Talmud, to go along with it and show what it truly means. For Christians, the Hebrew scriptures are really about Jesus, and thus they are prophecies of what the Messiah is going to do, and they become for them a book anticipating the New Testament, which they set along beside it and used to interpret it. For Muslims, the Hebrew scriptures are really just another version of the Quran. It's recorded in 3:2 and 3. Allah, there is no God but He, the living, the self-subsisting, eternal. It is He who sent down to thee step by step in truth the book, confirming what went before it. He sent down the law of Moses and the gospel of Jesus before this as a guide to mankind. He sent down the criterion for judgment between right and wrong. So while in theory, Muslim Christians and Jews all accept the Hebrew scriptures as authentic, they interpret them in radically different ways and find radically different meanings for them. Muslims accept both the Torah and the Gospel as the Old and New Testament, but in practice all is interpreted to conform to the Quran. In addition, Islam developed a body of literature about the life and practice of Muhammad that became authoritative for anything not clear in the Quran. The argument being that the Prophet knew more than he was told, and you could learn things from what he said and did. These are called hadith, or stories about the Prophet, presumably told by his companions. Thus we have the intriguing situation of all three traditions accepting the Hebrew scriptures, but finding them to mean radically different things. But because of this common heritage, they have produced remarkably similar end-time stories, and that is what I want to turn to next. That is, the end-time narrative is nearly identical in all three traditions. All three imagine that as the end of the time approaches, the world will fall into greater and greater chaos. There will be both human and natural disasters, even disruption of the universal order. The typical description runs something like this: you must understand this, that in the last days distressing times will come, for people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, inhuman, implacable, slanderers, profligate, brutes, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to the outward form of godliness but denying the power of it. In other words, something like the norm. At the heart of this chaos in all three traditions is the concept of human apostasy and depravity. For example, in response to the question about the signs of the end time, Ali, the son-in-law of Muhammad, is said to have replied, I saw the truth dead, its people gone, and injustice covering the land. I saw people claim the Quran was created, and that things were not in it, were invented, and directed according to the whims of people. And I saw the faith turn upside down, as the vessel is turned upside down. Now, all three have remarkably similar senses of what the end-time scenario will look like and what's wrong with the world. It should probably not surprise us that whenever anything disastrous happens in the Middle East or the oil supply or with the weather, somebody's going to write a book telling you that the end times have come and that what its implications are for Mideast oil or for other such things. Now, in all three traditions, behind this chaos that's emerging stands the rising power of evil, which all three traditions portray as focused on a person, an evil leader who presents a false front of piety and goodness. Some see him as the Messiah, but he's really the opposite. Messiah's arch enemy, the anti-Messiah, the Antichrist in Christianity. I should go back, but I don't know how, so you'll just have to take my word for it. There were just three words up there. The Antichrist in Christianity. Jews call him Amalus, Christians call him the Dajjal, or Muslims call him the Dajjal. But he has essentially the same characteristics. He will accumulate enormous power, often with a center in Jerusalem, Many will be deceived, but the faithful will resist his power and suffer crushing persecution. At the right time, God will send a true Savior, the Messiah of David for Jews, Jesus for Christians, and somewhat for Muslims, and the arrival of the Mahdi for Muslims. The Savior inaugurates a holy war against the Antichrist and all his forces, who are eventually destroyed, including the invasion of Gog and Magog in all three traditions. There follows a great day of judgment, in which all receive their rewards and punishment, followed by the creation of a perfect society, perhaps a new heaven and a new earth, the unification of God's people into one holy community. Of course, each tradition imagines that it's their holy community that will be the one that prevails in the end, and the other two traditions will either disappear, people will convert, or be assigned to the regions of the underworld. Now, before I get into some specific variations on that for the various traditions, I need a few words about the different traditions that we look at. It's awkward when I can't see what's up on the screen. Each of these traditions exist in multiple institutional forms and in multiple versions of an ideological form, which I'm going to call modernism, and a combination to the modern world. The modern ideas that they're not receptive to stem primarily from the European Enlightenment of the 18th century, an intellectual movement designed to explore the meaning of the world, specifically excluding revelation. The Enlightenment has had profound and long-lasting influence on our understanding of science, especially both physical and the social sciences. So I will begin with the Christian story, not because it's the oldest, though it may be, but because it's the most well-known. One of the distinctive aspects of the Christian version of the story is how fully it centers on the life of a historical person. We can see this in the 2nd century confession called the Apostles' Creed, which I have on the screen before you here. Notice how fully it centers on Jesus. That is, the main parts of the Creed talk about the life of a historical person. He is, notice the verbs, he's conceived, born, suffered, crucified, died, buried, descended, rose, ascended, seated, coming again. The notion of his second coming. From here, the story will expand, detailing what will happen at the second coming, the battle of Armageddon, the defeat of Satan, the final judgment, the creation of a new heaven and a new earth, and a new Jerusalem. Now, all Christians share this common story, involving the second coming of Jesus and triumph and judgment. They do not, however, understand that story in the same way. Christianity emerged at the height of the Roman Empire and had not completely settled its organizational structures before the empire divided into two. So that Christianity exists in multiple forms, the two oldest ones being Roman Catholicism, the Roman Empire, in the Latin-speaking world, and Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Empire, in the Greek-speaking world. In the East, the Bishop of Rome claimed primacy. The West did not so recognize him, or the East did not so recognize him. The overseers there of individual territories each claimed preeminence. They were called patriarchs, and the Orthodox Church exists in multiple versions, Russian, Greek, and so on, each theoretically independent of giving some precedence to the Patriarch of Constantinople as the first among equals. Eventually, in 1054, the two branches became divided absolutely, each rejecting the authority of the other with mutual bills of condemnation. That is, the Pope sent the Patriarch to hell, and the Patriarch returned the favor. Today, there are some discussions of reunification, and I hear the rumor that the Archbishop of Constantinople is going to attend the installation of the new Pope, which would be a first. It takes a while to get over these little differences. The third major division of Christianity is called Protestantism. It draws its name from the 16th century Reformation, where Reform-minded clergy and laity across Europe protested the excesses of corruption that had crept into Christian practice, such as the sale of indulgences, where for a certain amount of money you could have a certain number of sins guaranteed to be forgiven. Built on the practice of such egregious misconduct, the church eventually split between Catholic and Protestant And rejecting the teaching authority of the church and relying exclusively on the Bible as interpreted by the individuals, Protestantism has become an extremely diverse movement with literally hundreds of denominations. You can simplify the process somewhat by looking at the three strands that come from the Protestant Reformation. And what I will say is that in terms of the story of the end times, the further you go to the right here, the more apt you are to find a vivid and functional duty in the end times. Protestants are more apt than Catholics or Orthodox to take it literally, and the more Anabaptist tradition are more apt to take it more literally still. Some Protestant denominations actually have the end times written into their names, so that they were born out of a concern for the coming of the end times. And many of what we would call are called today Bible churches or community churches would be churches that take the end time scenario quite literally. Now, if we ask the additional question of why some Christians are intensely oriented toward the end times and others are not, a major factor is how comfortable the group feels in the modern world. We might imagine a continuum from full acceptance of modernity to a complete rejection of modernity. I will argue next week that the end times thinking is born in part from the existential experience that the world is not as it ought to be in some basic way. Here I only want to make the correlative assertion that end times thinking becomes more active and articulated for those groups most ill at ease in the world that we live in. The degree of alienation from the modern world can be seen clearly by considering three of the greatest innovations of that world: science, secular government, and gender equality. These are the issues that will divide these religious traditions into competing camps. A significant faction of Christians, especially in the United States, reject the scientific idea of evolution, dispute the science of climate change, believe women should be obedient to their husbands, and believe that this is or ought to be a Christian nation. These same Christians tend to be the most concerned about the end of the world, perhaps because this one is so unlike what they would like it to be. In Christianity, they are generally called and self-consciously choose titles like evangelicals or fundamentalists, even more conservative. They make up a considerable section of the Tea Party and generally vote Republican. I was raised in a church that belonged to one of these traditions. They called it a regular Baptist church. We had our fiber, I guess. I like to say I was in college before I knew you could be a Christian and a Democrat. It just didn't seem possible. In summary then, the belief in the return of Jesus is a basic Christian teaching shared by all branches of Christianity. They tell essentially the same story: the present age is evil, the final judgment, establishment of the kingdom of peace and prosperity. However, this is not what I would call a functional belief for most Christians. It does not function to orient their life in any significant manner. Those for whom it is functional are the Protestants, and especially the evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants. Now, mainstream Christianity is chary of end times thinking. Mainstream Jews are even more reserved. It's a classic story that illustrates this. Yohanan ben Zakkai, who had lived through the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70, is said to have taught, if you have this sapling in your hand and someone tells you, "Come quick, the Messiah is here," first finish planting the tree and then go and read the Messiah. Good advice that the Jews did not always follow, as we'll see in week 5. But the story itself points to the general Jewish story of the end times that is both like and unlike the Christian story. Both Judaism and Christianity emerged out of the religion of Israel at approximately the same time. The religion of Israel has been radically transformed by the 6th century conquest by Babylon, with the resulting experience of exile, and by the world conquest of Alexander the Great, with the resulting Hellenization. These transformations resulted in what is usually called Second Temple Judaism, because it coincides with the rebuilding of the temple in 500 and the destruction around 70. With the loss of the temple, Jewish leaders needed to fashion a new center for the people, a task accomplished brilliantly by the rabbis, who formulated a new understanding of what it means to be Jewish, codifying a new writing known as the Mishnah and the Talmud and associated literature. Drawing on biblical and Talmudic traditions, Jews look forward to a messianic utopia where peace and justice will prevail, Prior to this new age, there will be a cosmic battle against the forces of darkness led by the Messiah, or at least concluded by his coming. The focus of forces of darkness will be led by a satanic figure pretending to be a righteous person. Final battle will likely center on Jerusalem and will result in the triumph of the Messiah. God will return the Jews to their land, ending their exile, reestablish the temple, and all nations will recognize the God of Israel. This hope is dramatically portrayed in the traditional Passover prayer, so that the dominant themes of this version of the end-time story are Jerusalem, the temple, and the end of exile. At the end of this Messianic age, lasting perhaps 400 years, the dead will be raised and judged for their deeds. As with Christianity, interest in this story has waxed and waned over the centuries. Until the modern period, Judaism was not organizationally diverse. In fact, it wasn't organized at all. There were sort of an Eastern tradition and a Western tradition, but it was not an organizational unity. Only in the modern period, as a result of the Enlightenment, a form of Judaism emerged that's called Reform Judaism, which came to the conclusion that many of the laws of the Torah were obsolete, no longer made any sense, and no longer needed to be kept. This caused a strict division between them and Orthodox Jews who tried to keep all of the 613 commandments. And then a middle tradition emerged called Conservative Judaism, which a rabbi once explained to me is the Reformed Jew believes he can drive to the synagogue on the Sabbath day and does so that there's a parking lot he parks in. The Orthodox Jew believes he cannot drive on the Sabbath day, he leaves his car at home and walks to the synagogue. The Conservative Jew drives to a parking lot a block away and walks the last block. Now, I was a conservative rabbi who told me that, so we'll let it go at that. A conservative, like the Reform, believes that many of the laws are obsolete, but tries to keep as many of them as possible. But as with Christianity, there is also an ideological split in Judaism that does not respect organizational boundaries. Whereas Christians differentiate on the basis of ideas, for Judaism it is practice. Those who attempt to keep the strictest practice of earlier generations are called the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox are represented by Hasidic and Heretic movements. These are ideology, not unified movements. There are various kinds of Hasidim, various kinds of Heretic. They differ from one another as much as they do from other Jews sometimes, but they agree in their rejection of modernity, especially modern science, secularism, and gender equality. And like Christian fundamentalists, they regard their modernist co-religionists as inauthentic, that is not true Jews. In summary then, in Judaism as in Christianity, the further you go to the right on the spectrum, the more apt you are to take the end times story literally, and conversely those on the left take it symbolically or ignore it altogether. And again, the ideological split is important because those on the left, or those on the right, find the modernity unacceptable and thus long for change. Some Orthodox Jews claim the Messiah will appear before the year 6000, recalling that it's now 1574. Some of the ultra-Orthodox believe that the end of days is upon us already, and that in fact the existence of the state of Israel is itself an eschatological sign. We'll explore some of these groups more carefully in week number 6. Our third tradition, Islam, shares the same basic story, but has its own unique version of the story derived from the Quran and filled in by a variety of other sources. In the Islamic version, God wills to produce a perfect, just, and prosperous world, a world in which His word prevails, hence a Muslim world. But the world is evil and increasingly chaotic. Soon the great enemy of God will appear, called the Dajjal. God will meet the crisis by sending Jesus back into the world. Yes, Jesus back into the world. He's alive and on heaven, having never died, according to Muslim tradition. Jesus will descend to Damascus, or possibly in Jerusalem. He will attack and kill the Dajjal. Jesus will then rule the earth for 40 years, or maybe 7 or 9, depending on whom you read. Having set the record straight by ridding the world of swine, crosses, churches, and synagogues, Even more surprising than the return of Jesus, for Islam is the return of a second savior figure, the Mahdi, the rightly guided one, who functions somewhat differently in different Islamic traditions. The Mahdi is especially important for Shia Islam, as we'll see in a moment. Now, Islam consists of two major branches, the Shia and the Sunni, but they are not equal as my chart here falsely implies. Numbers are hard to come by here, but as best we can tell, 85% or more of Muslims follow the Sunni tradition. The division is also geographic. The purple maroon color is represents Shia concentrations, and the green Sunni. So that Iran, Iraq, and enclaves in Africa. Now, the split between Sunni and Shia occurred early and involved both political machinations and religious ideology. The Prophet Muhammad died just 10 years after moving to Medina, and only 2 years after unifying various Arab factions under his rule. He left no instructions for succession. He had no surviving sons, but one son-in-law, Ali, whom some thought should succeed him. But the majority chose one of Muhammad's companions, Abu Bakr, who himself only lived a couple more years. He was followed by two other companions, Umar, who lived 10 years and was killed, Uthman, who lived 11 years and was killed. Finally, they turned to Ali, but he only managed 5 years and was killed. Now, later generations would call these the four rightly guided caliphs, implying that later caliphs were not so regarded. By this time, less than 30 years after Muhammad's death, the caliphate had become a powerful, indeed an imperial force. Shia Islam was born in the struggle to succeed Ali. I'll return to that story in a moment, but first a word about the caliphs and the authority of in Islam. Caliphs were political rulers, not religious guides. Under their rule, procedures were developed for guiding the religious community by means of an agreed-on body of law, Sharia, the first principle of which is the absolute authority of the Quran. This is the book about which there is no doubt, a guidance for those conscious of Allah. 2:1. Where the Quran was not completely clear, one could look to the Prophet's life for guidance. For example, the duty to go on pilgrimage is clear in the Quran, but what you do on pilgrimage is not so clear. And so we turn to look at what Muhammad did and gain guidance from that. Now, we need to be clear, Muhammad is not a divine figure in Islam. His role is radically different from the role of Jesus in Christianity. Nonetheless, he is of central importance. As the first of the 5 great pillars of Islam is there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God. So everything is filtered through the revelation that he claimed. Because God chose to follow the revelation through him, he surely understood better than anyone else what God intended. Thus, things he said and did would be instructive for the community. Numerous, and eventually innumerable, stories about what the prophet did and said were developed. These are called hadith. Each hadith consists of 2 parts, one part tracing its lineage, where it comes from, and the other part saying what the tradition or saying or practice is that is supported. So there's a chain of tradition, and the authenticity of the hadith is based on the integrity of the chain of tradition, not on what is taught, as it would be in historical Jesus studies. An early definition runs, a sacred hadith is as to meaning from Allah, as to wording from the messenger of Allah. The Quran itself has little to say about the details of the hour. The details are derived from hadith, and those hadith are varied, contradictory, and different ones claimed by different factions with many different versions of the story. Now, in addition to Quran and hadith, Islamic leaders appeal to 2 additional factors, argument by analogy and community consensus, to figure out what proper practice is. This has resulted in 4 orthodox schools of law that the Sunni recognize. Each of them has differences and look to different traditions and have different conclusions, but are enough alike that each accepts the other as genuinely Muslim. Now, some Sunnis today are willing to look at the Shia as simply a 5th school of legal interpretation, but it's not quite that simple. So let's return to the story of the caliphate after Ali. So the name Shia is short for Ali, the party or the faction of Ali. A significant faction thought that Ali should have been the successor of the Prophet, claiming that he and his sons inherited both the political authority and the religious guidance of Muhammad. The idea that the leader possessed both civil and religious authority is the essential difference between Sunni and Shia Islam. The development of Shia Islam took place in a time of rapid expansion, wars, political intrigue, and competition for power, to say nothing of assassinations, abductions, and ransoms. For our purposes, we need only a general survey. When Ali died, his followers decided that the mantle fell to Hassan, the son of Ali and Fatima, Muhammad's daughter, and thus the grandson of the Prophet. But a powerful leader of a rival clan, Muawiyah, claimed the caliphate. Hassan was reluctant to challenge him, and seeking refuge in Medina, he soon met death by poisoning. When Muawiyah died, the caliphate passed to his son Yazid. Ali's followers turned to the younger son of Ali, Hussein, but he too was killed in what is called the Battle of Carroll, where Hussein and a small band of less than 100 followers were slaughtered by an army of perhaps 4,000 of Muawiyah's men. The Shia commemorate his martyrdom to this day, an intense day of mourning, and history of defeat and martyrdom colors the story of Shia to this day. That is, Shia are much more pessimistic about the world than Sunnis are. In fact, I think only it's too much to say that if they're doing right, they expect to be suffering. So the surest way to convince them that they're doing right about the present course of political action is to try and make them feel as uncomfortable as possible. Because the more it hurts, the more sure you are you're doing the right thing. Further rebellion arose 5 years later, and another of Ali's sons was presented as the rightly guided one. The word for rightly guided one is Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I. He too would soon perish, or did he? Stories spread that he'd gone into hiding in the mountains around Medina, from which he would soon return and exact vengeance. And so was born a powerful religious idea, the idea of the hidden Mahdi. Now, whether the hidden Mahdi is the 7th or the 12th depends on which sect of the Shia that you ask, but the paradigm is the same. The true leader of the community now exists in another sphere of being from which he is expected to return and set things right. While belief in the coming of the Mahdi is central to the Shia, Sunnis too generally expect his coming at the end times. We'll explore these conceptions more fully in week 5. In addition to the significant difference between Sunni and Shia, between various sectarian movements among the Shia, Islam also manifests an ideological division that rejects modernity in favor of traditional practice. In fact, Islam exhibits the same continuum of responses to modernity as do Judaism and Christianity, ranging from traditionalists to the modernists. There are also a kind of hyper-traditionalists, such as the Taliban and the Wahhabis. We do not have a good collective noun for these groups. The popular press refers to them as fundamentalist Muslims. I take that to be an imposition of a Christian idea on them. And there are various titles that are used: Islamicists, Salafi, and Jihadists being three of the three most common, and all in some ways appropriate, but none perfectly adequate. The least pejorative in my mind is the Salafi, and that is the term I'm going to use for those Muslims who adopt a strongly traditional interpretation of Islam. They seek to do things the way earlier generations, especially the earliest generation of Muslims, did them. As a consequence, they oppose much of modernity, including the theory of evolution, secularism, and gender equality. Their practice of Islam tends to be rigorously legalistic, even oppressive, but they are not by and large terrorists. In fact, various Salafi leaders have issued fatwas against terrorism, denouncing the killing of other Muslims, and forbidding suicide bombings. The form of Islam dominant in Saudi Arabia is a Salafist sect known as the Wahhabis, derived from the 18th century reformist movement. They aim to strip Islam of its worldly accretions and return it to its pure form of its beginning. They're often described as puritanical, isolationist, patriarchal. They maintain an uneasy truce with the Saudi ruling family by trading their support for the family in exchange for their recognition as the state form of Islam in Saudi Arabia. Now, it's not easy to estimate how many Muslims might think of themselves as Salafi. Estimates I've seen run over 50%, which would be a far greater percentage of the group than is true of either Judaism or Christianity. Some caution is called for, however, since these classifications are not used the same way by different people. I looked at the recent Egyptian election, and it looks like about a third of the voting went to what we would call secular candidates, and the other two-thirds to Islamist, Salafist candidates, of which there are many different sorts. In summary, then, the end-time scenario of Islam is remarkably parallel to both that of Judaism and Christianity. All three share the notion of living in declining times, getting worse, and that we would somehow come to an end. They share with Christians the idea of the second coming of Jesus. Though this time he is clearly a Muslim, he and the Mahdi will overthrow the Dajjal and establish a true Muslim society. However, in the Quran at least, there is the strongest possible connection between this notion of the final hour and the need to repent and believe in God, including the need to establish proper forms of Islam throughout the world. For Islam, the first meaning of the final hour is to be ready for it, which is summarized in that powerful little word, jihad. So while all three traditions share a common story with an exceptional number of common details, each sets the story in a unique context, giving it a particular meaning. The same story functions differently in the different traditions. For Jews, the end of days is about the restoration of Israel and the end of exile, Jerusalem. For Christians, the last days are about the completion of the work of Jesus, the rest of the story, as it were, Jesus. For Muslims, the final hour is about the struggle to make the world a better place, now clarified through the revelation of Muhammad, jihad. Jerusalem, Jesus, and jihad. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, but you'll have to come back another time if you want to find out more about that. So to return to what I said at the beginning, who says it's the end of time? One answer is those factions within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam who reject modernity and as created by the European Enlightenment, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the evangelical Christians, the Salafi Muslims. But we see that in the weeks ahead, that these are not uniform movements themselves, differing especially in the role being played by the believer in the end times. Another answer to the question of who says is that all Jews, Christians, and Muslims say that the end times are approaching, over half the world's population. And they agree that the worse the present time becomes, the more likely the end times will appear. This means that there's an essential element of instability in end times thinking. That is, you want it to get worse, because the worse it gets, the better you are. It doesn't take too many zealots to turn a bad situation into an even worse one. We should see these processes at work in weeks 4 and 5. Among the questions I intend to raise in the rest of the lecture series are the ones you see on the screen. That is, I want to ask, what does it mean that these people believe these things? And next week we're going to address the question of where do these ideas come from? Feeling that if you can understand something of where they come from, perhaps you can understand something of how they function in the present condition. And finally, we knew it would come eventually, I want to say, on a positive note, if I can just find it. All three traditions depend on the end as a goal. They describe the goal in remarkably similar terms, the creation of time of peace and justice and prosperity. Here too I can look with my grandmother's eyes and say, this, the present state of the world, is not the end of the world. It's not the end we can imagine. It's not the end we can hope for. That end can be imagined, perhaps it can be attained. Or at least a more just and peaceful world is, as the Barr had Hamlet say, contemplating his own end, a consummation devoutly to be reached. So we have time for a few questions. I'll try to keep my answers brief. You keep your questions brief, and we'll be out of here in 2 more minutes.
Was your grandmother the author of the quest eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you live?
Grandmother had a rather rough life, actually. Married to an alcoholic husband, and she was not bitter about the whole thing. And I've only learned to appreciate her as well. The second part, where she would say, "You'll forget all about it by the time you're married." I've later come to think that maybe the end of the world and getting married were related ideas in her mind. Another question, comment, any remark? Last chance? Sir?
When you conclude the Islamic religion, there was one graphic that was assumed in the sky. They also had symbols too.
Right.
Are these more radical?
No, the Sufi is hard to place in this tradition. It is a way of being a Muslim that both Sunnis and Shia follow. It's more mystical, less concerned with correct practice, with correct ideas, and open to much more radicalization. You'll see a little bit later down the road. It's a mystical form of Islam. It's late. The night is young, but we are not. Thank you.